What if the most feared warriors in the United States Navy humiliated a frail old man at lunchtime, only to discover too late that he was the single most dangerous survivor in their entire history? The mess hall at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado buzzed the way living military spaces always do. Metal trays clattering, boots striking linoleum. The low roar of 100 overlapping conversations. It was the sound of routine, of discipline, of young bodies pushed toward perfection. But beneath the fluorescent lights and stainless steel counters, something else simmered. A generational divide waiting for the wrong spark. That spark came from Petty Officer Miller. He stood tall, broad, and sculpted by years of elite training. He and his two teammates, both Navy Sea, air and land operators, moved through the room like apex predators, their confidence carving out invisible space around them. The three of them formed an intimidating triangle as they stopped beside a small table where a single elderly man sat alone. "Hey, Pop," Miller said, voice slick with the kind of bravado only youth and perfect conditioning can produce. "What was your rank back in the Stone Age?" Some nearby sailors snickered, others winced but kept their eyes down. Confronting a Navy Sea, air and land operator in public was the social equivalent of stepping into oncoming artillery fire. No one wanted to be caught in the blast radius. 87-year-old George Stanton did not look up. He did not flinch. He simply lifted another spoonful of chili to his lips, his hand steady, despite the thin, wrinkled skin stretched over it. He wore a tweed jacket, brown and soft with age, paired with a white shirt that had gone slightly yellow over the decades. The outfit looked as though it belonged to another century, another country, another world. Around him swirled modern warriors in digital camouflage, steel discipline, and the restless hunger of young men shaped into weapons, yet George seemed untouched by all of it, like a stone sitting in the middle of a river that had flowed around him for too long to move him now. Miller smirked at his teammates. They nodded, approving the show. He leaned in closer to George, tattooed forearms planted on the table, the gesture more territorial than curious. "I am talking to you, old-timer," Miller said. "This is a military installation. You must have a pass to be here. Or did you wander in from the retirement home looking for a free meal?" The mess hall's din changed. Conversations slowed. Forks paused mid-air. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Everyone knew this was no longer just a loud young sailor being obnoxious. This was becoming a performance, and the unwilling centerpiece was an old man who seemed more interested in chili than confrontation. George set his spoon down with careful precision. No wasted motion. No sudden reactions. Not even a sigh. This quiet calm, this refusal to engage poured gasoline on the fire of Miller's ego. "Look at me when I am talking to you," Miller growled, dropping the mocking tone and letting aggression slip through the cracks. Still, George did not look up. The older sailors knew exactly what they were watching. Not a power struggle, but a ritual humiliation, young dominance against elderly vulnerability. They had seen versions of this before, unspoken social tests where arrogance masqueraded as authority, but this one felt different. This one felt wrong. Miller jabbed a finger toward George's lapel. "And what is that?" he sneered. "That cheap little pin? You buy that at the surplus store to impress the ladies?" The pin, a small pair of stylized wings, and a shield was dull with age, its edges worn smooth. Anyone with real historical knowledge might have recognized the design, but Miller did not have historical knowledge. Miller had muscles, confidence, and the dangerous belief that the world revolved around modern rank. The instant his finger touched the air in front of that pin, George's world flickered. The smell of chili vanished, replaced by the sharp sting of ozone and damp earth. The chatter of sailors dissolved into the shriek of diving enemy aircraft. And somewhere far away, yet impossibly close, the thud of anti-aircraft fire echoed against his ribs. A young hand strong, sure, trembling from adrenaline, more than fear clamped onto his shoulder in memory. "See you on the other side." "Ghost," a familiar voice whispered through the roar. Just one sentence. Just one ghost from 1943. But it slammed into George with the force of a lifetime. He blinked hard, and the mess hall snapped back into place. fluorescent lights, stainless steel. Miller's furious face inches from his own. George inhaled slowly. Grounding himself, the memory retreated, but the weight of it lingered like a shadow. Across the room, a 19-year-old seaman apprentice named Davis watched the entire exchange. He was new enough in the Navy to still believe in honor codes and respect for elders. He was young enough to feel righteous anger surge in his throat as he watched Miller, a man he had admired until this moment, lean closer to the old stranger like a schoolyard bully. Davis remembered his own grandfather, a Marine veteran from a brutal winter battle overseas, being brushed aside in a grocery store by a teenager who had never held anything heavier than a phone, watching it happen again now. In uniform, on a United States Navy base, felt like a betrayal of everything he had sworn to uphold. But Davis was 19. Miller was a Navy Sea, Air and Land petty officer. Intervening would be the end of Davis's career before it even began. He swallowed hard, eyes flicking toward the kitchen phone. A desperate idea formed, not a brave idea, not a smart idea, but a necessary one. Back at the table, Miller straightened and thrust out a hand. "Let me see your identification," he demanded. Now, no one in the room needed training to know that this was a gross violation of procedure. But no one moved. No one spoke. The price of challenging a Navy Sea, Air and Land operator was too high. George calmly reached, not for his wallet, but for his cup of water. Abe took a long sip. The silence grew thicker. Miller's face reddened. The humiliation now cutting him instead of the old man he intended to dominate. And then, the sound of a chair leg scraping the floor echoed from the back of the kitchen. Seaman Davis had made his choice. He was moving, but he had no idea that what he was about to do would summon a force far greater and far more dangerous than Miller could ever imagine. The mess hall felt tighter now, as if the air itself sensed a line had been crossed. Petty Officer Miller leaned in again, his breath hot with rising anger, his tattooed arms forming a cage around the elderly man who refused to respond. George Stanton's quiet stillness was like sandpaper against Miller's ego, scraping away the illusion of control he wore so easily. Around them, nearby sailors shifted in their seats, every instinct telling them this was spiraling toward something dangerous. George did not lift his gaze, not even a fraction of an inch. His fingers rested gently on the rim of his cup, the posture. So calm, it almost looked rehearsed. It was restraint born of entire decades of carrying memories too heavy for most men to comprehend. That composure only infuriated Miller further, as if the very act of silence was a personal insult carved into stone. "Look at me when I am speaking to you," Miller growled, his voice dropping into something far darker than simple mockery. The mess hall seemed to shrink with the weight of his tone, and even his teammates exchanged uneasy glances. Arrogance was expected from a Navy Sea, Air and Land operator, but this was slipping into something uglier, something that made even the boldest watchers lower their eyes. Still, George did not respond. His jaw moved, slow and steady, as if he were finishing a thought rather than facing a threat. The entire scene felt like a mismatch in tempo. Miller was accelerating toward violence, while George moved at the rhythm of a man who had stared down far worse than a young bruiser with something to prove. It was the collision of two worlds. Blind confidence meeting, unshakable experience. Miller's frustration boiled over. He reached down and jabbed a finger toward the pin on George's lapel, sneering as he said, "This cheap little trinket is not fooling anyone. Tell me where you bought it." The insult hung in the air, sharp and cutting, and the room responded with a collective flinch. Everyone knew the moment you mocked a man's service real, or assumed you stepped into sacred territory that no rank could shield you from. George's breath hitched so faintly that only someone watching him closely would have noticed. A strange stillness passed over his face, the kind that belongs to someone hearing a sound from another lifetime. The mess hall blurred for a heartbeat, replaced by shadows of rain-soaked earth, the scream of distant aircraft, and the rattling percussion of anti-aircraft fire tearing the sky apart. The smell of chili dissolved, replaced by the metallic scent of fear and lightning. A young hand firm, steady, yet trembling clamped down on his shoulder in that memory. A whisper cut through the chaos. A voice he had not heard in more than 70 years. "See you on the other side." Ghost. The words rose out of the past like a flare, burning bright for a moment before falling back into darkness. Then the memory receded, and the mess hall snapped back into harsh fluorescent focus. Across the room, Seaman Apprentice Davis watched everything unfold, and his stomach knotted with dread. He was 19, still new enough to believe the Navy lived entirely by its codes of respect, discipline, and honor. Yet here, he was watching a decorated member of a prestigious unit bully an elderly man in plain sight. It was not only humiliating, it was a violation of something sacred that Davis could not articulate, but felt in every nerve. He remembered his own grandfather standing in a grocery store aisle years ago, ignored by a clerk who saw only an old man and not the Marine, who had survived a legendary winter battle overseas. Watching Miller now twisted that memory deeper, turning admiration into something closer to heartbreak. But Davis also understood rank. He understood informal power. He understood that challenging a Navy Sea, air and land operator could end his future before it ever began. His eyes flicked to the wall-mounted kitchen phone. It was a lifeline. Affable, an emergency option, a choice that balanced courage and stupidity on the same fragile point. He swallowed hard, pulse thumping against his throat, and stepped backward into the kitchen. His hands shook as he moved. Not from fear of Miller, but from the weight of what he was about to risk. He could not save George with strength, but he could call someone who could move mountains. Meanwhile, Miller straightened, puffing himself up with a kind of manufactured authority that was not supported by any regulation. "Let me see your identification," he demanded, palm held out in command. The room bristled at the obvious breach in protocol, but still no one moved. Everyone knew this was wrong. But no one dared step between a Navy Sea, air and land operator, and his pride. Silence became complicity, and complicity became fuel. George reached not for a wallet, but for his cup of water, and took a slow, measured sip. The gesture was simple, but in the context of Miller's aggression, it felt like a declaration. A refusal, a deeper kind of strength than fists or rank could produce, and as the water slid down his throat, the entire mess hall held its breath. Miller's face reddened, humiliation blooming across his skin as his authority slipped in front of an audience he desperately wanted to impress. Then the sound came, a single chair leg scraping across the tile floor at the back of the kitchen. Seaman Apprentice Davis had made his decision. His hand reached for the phone, his fingers began to dial, and he had absolutely no idea that the name he was about to speak into that receiver would trigger an avalanche powerful enough to shake the entire base within minutes. The kitchen was hot, loud, and filled with steam. But Seaman Apprentice Davis barely noticed any of it as he gripped the wall phone with trembling fingers. His pulse hammered in his ears, while he dialed the extension he knew by heart but never expected to use. The number belonged to the office of the Command Master Chief, the highest enlisted authority on the entire base. He prayed someone would answer before he lost the nerve to follow through. A bored yeoman picked up on the second ring and said the standard greeting with all the enthusiasm of a man neck-deep in paperwork. Davis spoke quickly, stumbling over his own breath as he explained that there was a situation in the mess hall involving Petty Officer Miller and an elderly visitor. The yeoman sighed loudly, already preparing to dismiss him, and told Davis to file a report with the Master-at-Arms like everyone else. It was obvious he had no interest in leaving his desk over a lunchtime altercation. Desperation pushed Davis past hesitation. His voice cracked as he forced out the name he only knew because he had overheard someone mention it moments earlier. "The veteran's name is George Stanton," he said, voice low but urgent. The silence that followed was immediate and unnerving, stretching long enough for Davis to wonder if the call had been dropped. Something in that name had frozen the yeoman completely. A muffled voice came through the line. The yeoman was speaking to someone in the room with him. Urgency. Suddenly replacing boredom, Davis heard papers rustling, a chair scraping, and then a new voice cut sharply into the phone. "This is Master Chief Thorne. Repeat the name you just said." The authority in that voice hit Davis like a physical force. He stood straighter, even though no one could see him, and repeated, "George Stanton." Another silence followed, But this one was charged, electric, and impossible to misinterpret. Master Chief Thorne inhaled once, sharply, and then spoke with the quiet intensity of a man preparing for battle. Son, keep your eyes on George Stanton. Do not let him out of your sight. Help is on the way. The line went dead before Davis could respond, leaving him with the phone pressed to his ear and his heart thundering. Across the base, in a command building surrounded by glass and order, Master Chief Thorne rose from his chair so fast that his coffee cup rattled violently on its saucer. His weathered face went pale, as if someone had spoken the name of a ghost instead of a living man. The yeoman stared at him, confused and alarmed. But Thorne did not explain. He barked commands with a force that cracked through the office like a whip. Get me the base commander on the private line. Now, oh. The yeoman nearly tripped over himself, complying. Thorne was already snatching his cover from the edge of his desk. His jaw set hard enough to crack. And find out if Admiral Hayes has left for the airfield? He ordered. If he has not, tell his convoy to turn around immediately. It is a matter of operational history. The phrase rang through the room like an alarm, but no one understood what it meant. Operational history was not a term used lightly, and certainly not over a mess hall disturbance. Back in the mess hall, tensions were spiraling out of control. Petty Officer Miller, feeling his authority crumble and sensing the attention of the entire room focused on him, decided he had reached his limit. He tightened his grip on George's frail arm and began pulling the old man from his chair. His voice twisted into a snarl as he declared George a security risk on a secure facility, as if the words themselves granted him the power he lacked. The room recoiled at the lie, and the arrogance behind it. George stood not because Miller forced him, but because he had chosen to. His movements were slow, deliberate, and marked by an exhaustion deeper than age alone. He rose with a quiet dignity that contrasted sharply with Miller's aggression. The sight made several sailors look away, ashamed to witness what they could not prevent. Everything had become too quiet, too still, like the air before a brewing storm. Then the doors at the entrance of the mess hall exploded, opened with a violent slam that echoed across the tiles. The sound jolted every person in the room, snapping heads toward the source. Framed in the doorway stood the base commander, his uniform immaculate and his expression carved from granite. At his side was Master Chief Thorne, radiating an intensity that made even seasoned sailors stiffen. Behind them stepped two Marine Guards in full-dress uniform, an appearance so formal and out of place in a cafeteria that the entire room froze in confusion. But it was the man walking between them who changed the air completely. He wore a crisp, white service uniform, and on his shoulders glinted 3 silver stars. A vice admiral had entered the mess hall without warning, without ceremony, and with an expression so sharp it could cut steel. Miller's hand was still on George's arm when the vice admiral's eyes found them, and in that frozen second, the entire room realized that this was no ordinary visitor. The vice admiral did not pause, did not acknowledge the stunned salutes rising around the room, and did not break eye contact with the small, tense scene unfolding at the center of the mess hall. Every step he took toward George Stanton and Petty Officer Miller carried a weight that pressed down on the entire room. The silence thickened until even the hum of the ventilation system seemed muted. Miller, who only moments before radiated absolute confidence, now looked like a man trapped under a spotlight. He did not understand. When the Admiral reached the table, he stopped directly in front of George. His gaze flicked once to Miller's hand gripping the old man's arm, and the disapproval in his eyes was colder than any shouted reprimand. Miller felt the message immediately and released his grip as though he had been burned. The young operators behind him stiffened, uncertainty replacing their earlier amusement. None of them could explain why a 3-star flag officer had appeared in their cafeteria, but they all sensed that something enormous was about to break. Then the Admiral squared his shoulders, raised his right hand, and delivered a salute so sharp it seemed to slice through the silence. Every sailor in the room saw it. Every elf dropped. A 3-star admiral was saluting the frail old man in the tweed jacket. It felt impossible, wrong, like someone had inverted the laws of military hierarchy. but the Admiral held the salute with complete sincerity, as though it were the most natural gesture in the world. "Mr. Stanton," the Admiral said, voice clear and resonant. "It is an honor." "Sire?" The word "sir" echoed through the mess hall with the force of a detonation. Miller's face drained of color as realization began to creep into the edges of his mind. Every sailor in the room stared, shocked into stillness, trying to reconcile the scene in front of them. A man they had dismissed as a random elderly visitor was being addressed by a vice admiral with reverence usually reserved for legends. The admiral lowered his salute, but did not look away from George. "We had you listed on the visitor manifest for the memorial dedication," he continued. "My aide apparently failed to inform me that you had already arrived. I sincerely apologize for the oversight." Murmurs rippled through the watching crowd. Officers who had never seen the admiral apologize for anything exchanged glances of confusion and awe. Someone near the back whispered, "Who is this man?" But no one had an answer. George did not speak at first. His pale eyes studied the admiral with a calm that bordered on timeless. Something unspoken passed between the two men, something built on memory, sacrifice, and decades of history no one else in the room had lived through. Slowly, George nodded, acknowledging the apology with quiet grace. The movement was small, but its impact rolled through the mess hall like thunder. The admiral finally turned, raising his voice so that every person in the room could hear him. "For those of you who do not know," he began, "you are standing in the presence of George Stanton." The mess hall held its breath. Miller looked as though his knees might buckle. The admiral's voice shifted into the measured cadence of a historian recounting a sacred text. "In the year 1943, as a 20-year-old Navy Combat Demolition Unit Specialist, a frogman, a predecessor to our modern sea, air and land teams, Mr. Stanton participated in a mission known as Operation Nightfall. He paused, letting the name settle like dust over the room. The mission was compromised from the beginning. 12 men were inserted behind enemy lines. 11 were killed in the first hour. Only 1 survived." A faint gasp came from one of the younger sailors. The admiral continued, his tone somber. "For 72 hours, George Stanton evaded capture on an island crawling with enemy patrols. He completed the mission alone, destroying 3 fortified listening posts using improvised explosives and a knife. A wave of disbelief washed across the hall. No one spoke. No one moved. The admiral pressed on. When the extraction team found him, he had subsisted on roots and rainwater, and had eliminated 17 enemy combatants without firing a single shot. For his actions, he received the Medal of Honor. The world knew him as the Ghost of Luzon. Every sailor felt the gravity of the words settle in their chest. Medal of Honor. Ghost of Luzon. The quiet old man in the tweed jacket was not simply a veteran. He was a myth, come to life. The admiral turned his gaze toward Miller, and the weight of that stare crushed whatever pride the young operator had left. His voice sharpened. "The pin on Mr. Stanton's lapel, the one you mocked, is the original unofficial insignia of his unit. It was given to him by his team leader, who died in his arms on the beach." Miller swallowed hard, his face gray with shame, as the truth carved itself into him. His casual taunt had been aimed at a symbol of sacrifice he could not begin to fathom. George's gaze drifted to the pin, and memory washed through him again. Rain battered a muddy foxhole. A dying friend pressed the small metal insignia into his palm with trembling fingers. "Make it home." "Ghost," the young man whispered, his voice breaking. "Make it home and tell them. Tell them we tried." George blinked once, grounding himself again as the memory faded. The base commander stepped forward, his anger barely contained. His eyes locked onto Miller with deadly precision. When he finally spoke, his voice was a quiet blade. "Petty Officer Miller, you are a disgrace to the trident on your chest. You will report to my office in 5 minutes. You will be escorted by the Master-at-Arms. You will bring your service record." He leaned in closer, voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Use the next 4 minutes to contemplate the totality of your mistake." The entire room waited for George's reaction, unsure whether he would allow the punishment or intervene. And then, unexpectedly, George Stanton drew a breath. and prepared to speak for the first time. George Stanton lifted his chin slightly, the gesture small but powerful enough to shift the room's energy. The Admiral fell silent instantly, and even the base commander held his breath as the old man finally prepared to speak. His voice, when it came, was soft and rasped with age, yet carried a natural authority that settled over every watching sailor. "He is just a boy." "Jim," George said, addressing the Admiral by his first name without hesitation. The room reacted as if struck. No one called a 3-star Admiral by his first name, not unless they had earned the right through blood, history, and deep personal respect. George continued, his tone steady and calm, full of fire. "We were all like that once. Arrogant, sure of ourselves. The service will temper him, or it will break him." His eyes rested on Miller without malice. Only truth. The Admiral listened with a tight jaw, torn between discipline and reverence. George's words were not a defense of Miller's behavior, but something more profound, a reminder that humility must be learned, not inherited. The base commander exhaled slowly, the tension easing by a fraction. George nodded once more. Sealing his decision, "Let the boy learn his lesson," he said quietly, "but do not ruin him for it." Miller's shoulders sagged, as if the forgiveness itself was heavier than any punishment. His eyes were red around the edges, shame carving deep lines into a face that had not known humility until this moment. He stared at the floor, unable to meet George's gaze. For the first time since the confrontation began, he looked like a young man rather than an elite warrior. The Admiral studied him with an expression that blended disappointment, reflection, and the faintest flicker of understanding. George brushed his fingertips across the worn pin on his lapel, and a different memory surfaced, one of mud, rain, and loss, so profound it had never fully lifted. He remembered kneeling beside his wounded team leader as the night pressed in around them. The man's breath had been ragged and shallow, his body going cold, despite the tropical heat. With trembling fingers, he had pushed the tin insignia into George's palm. "Tell them we tried," he whispered. "Do not let them forget us." The weight of that promise was heavier than any medal he ever received. When George blinked, the mess hall settled back into focus. The Admiral's eyes softened as he watched the old man return from the depths of memory. Around them, the young sailors, those who lived in a world of technology, training schedules, and controlled environments, found themselves seeing something they had never confronted before. Not just courage, but the aftermath of courage. Not just survival, but the burden that followed it. Master Chief Thorne stepped forward, the deep respect etched into every line of his face. He saluted George without hesitation, a gesture of profound appreciation from one seasoned warrior to another. The mess hall followed suit, every sailor rising in unison as the room filled with the soft thunder of heels snapping together. Dozens of salutes rose toward the man who had walked through fire long before many of their parents had even been born. The sight overwhelmed the Miller, who worked his jaw as if fighting back words. He was not sure he had the right to speak. He looked at George again, but the old man offered a gentle nod that felt like mercy. The base commander, still stern but no longer burning with silent fury, motioned for the master-at-arms to escort Miller. The young operator followed, not resisting, not posturing. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a heavy awareness of the legacy he had insulted. As the Marines, the Admiral, and the base commander began to guide George toward the exit, the room parted like a tide. Every sailor stood at attention, watching him pass. Some had tears in their eyes. Others stared with awe, realizing they were witnessing a moment that would become base legend. George walked with slow, steady steps, his posture fragile yet dignified, as though he were carrying ghosts behind him that no one else could see. But even as he made his way toward the door, the room remained suspended in silence. Something important had shifted in the hearts of every person present. They had seen the weight of sacrifice. They had seen humility teach a lesson sharper than anger ever could. And they had seen a man who had once crawled through hell offer forgiveness to a sailor who desperately needed it. Yet while the mess hall slowly returned to life, One person could not shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much deeper reckoning. Because the story of George Stanton was not finished, not by a long shot. The fallout from the mess hall incident began before the lunch trays were even cleared. Word spread through the base with the speed and precision of a classified alert, moving from barracks to hangars to offices. In a chain reaction of disbelief, sailors repeated the story in low voices, each retelling adding another layer of awe. The name George Stanton had transformed from an unknown into a living legend within a single hour. Petty Officer Miller faced immediate consequences. He was stripped of rank, removed from team rotation, and assigned to remedial duty that felt more like penance than punishment. The base commander ordered him to write a 2,000-word essay on the history of naval special warfare, with specific emphasis on pre-sea, air and land demolition units. The assignment was less about discipline and more about forcing him to understand the lineage he had taken for granted, but the real punishment for Miller was not on paper. It was the story itself, echoing through every hallway and whispered between junior sailors who had watched the entire scene unfold. His arrogance had become a cautionary tale, a reminder that tradition mattered just as much as skill. Older chiefs shook their heads when his name came up, not with cruelty, but with disappointment deep enough to sting. Miller carried that weight in every room he entered. Master Chief Thorne took the incident personally. He saw it as a failure of memory within the ranks, a dangerous drift from the heritage that defined the Navy's soul. At his urging, the base commander implemented a new training requirement. Every quarter, from the newest seaman to the most senior officer, the entire base would attend sessions called Naval Heritage. The first lesson was the story of Operation Nightfall. The second was the transcript of the mess hall confrontation. The training became mandatory across multiple units. Sailors sat in classrooms as Thorne stood before them, reading the events aloud with a sternness that left no room for misinterpretation. He spoke not to shame Miller, but to remind everyone that the uniform carried responsibilities older than any of them. During those sessions, the room remained silent, the weight of history pressing on every listener. No one forgot the lesson. George kept his distance during the chaos that followed. He did not seek attention and did not linger at the base. The Admiral ensured he received a proper escort and insisted he attend the memorial ceremony as the honored guest. During the event, younger sailors watched from afar, whispering about him as if he were made of myth rather than flesh. George spoke only when spoken to, offering polite nods and a few quiet words to those who approached with respect. When the ceremony ended, George slipped away from the crowd as quietly as he had arrived. The Admiral attempted to walk him to his vehicle, but George insisted he was fine. He was not interested in becoming a symbol. He had lived long enough to know that the men who never came home deserved the glory more than he did. He carried his memories privately, like folded letters kept deep inside a coat pocket. Weeks passed. The base continued its routines. Morning drills, evening watch rotations, briefings, fitness tests, and endless maintenance. Yet every sailor had felt something shift. The incident had reminded them that greatness could walk among them in silence, unnoticed until someone finally looked up. Conversations in the galley changed. Young recruits asked veterans for stories. Chiefs spoke more openly about sacrifices from decades before. The air of the base held more humility. One afternoon, Miller found himself walking through a quiet park in Coronado, the weight of his own shame still pressing on him. He had lost weight, his posture smaller, his eyes less filled with the sharpness he once projected. He had spent nights rereading the history of the Frogmen, trying to understand the men whose shoulders he had been standing on without realizing it. The more he learned, the heavier the guilt became. As he followed a winding path lined with palm trees, he saw a familiar figure sitting on a bench feeding seagulls. The old man's posture was relaxed. His gaze on the horizon beyond the water. Miller stopped in place, every instinct urging him to turn around. He was not ready. He did not deserve forgiveness. Yet something deeper, something steadier, kept him rooted to the ground. Courage did not always look like charging into combat. Sometimes it looked like walking toward the person you had wronged. He approached slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached the bench, he stopped a respectful distance away. George glanced up. his pale blue eyes calm and unreadable. Miller swallowed hard, feeling his throat tighten. "Sir," he said quietly, I wanted to say that I am sorry." The words sounded too small for the weight behind them. George studied him without speaking. His silence was not cold, just patient. After a moment that stretched long enough to fill the space between them, he nodded toward the empty end of the bench. "Sit down, son." Miller obeyed immediately, lowering himself onto the bench as if it were a privilege rather than permission. They sat side by side, watching the birds pick at breadcrumbs on the grass. For a long time, neither man spoke. The breeze carried the smell of salt water. Children laughed in the distance. A dog barked. The world moved gently around them, without urgency, without judgment. Finally, George said, "You have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use them in that proportion." His voice remained soft, but the lessons sank deep. The quietest man in the room is often the one worth listening to. He is watching. He is learning. He is carrying weight. You cannot see. "Oh," Miller nodded, blinking hard. He did not trust himself to speak. Every part of him felt small, but not in a way that diminished him. It felt like the beginning of something better. It felt like understanding. George did not lecture him further. He did not preach or scold. Instead, he allowed the silence to teach the rest. Sometimes silence carried the most powerful truths of all. They remained there together, 2 generations separated by nearly 7 decades, sharing a bench without ceremony. The seagulls circled closer, pecking at crumbs. The sky shifted as the sun dipped lower. Miller breathed deeper than he had in weeks, the air finally clearing around him. George, with quiet patience, had given him something no reprimand could deliver, a path back to humility. But deep beneath that peaceful moment, something else stirred a remaining story, a final truth that had yet to surface. Because the world knew George Stanton as the ghost of Luzon, but there was one part of his past that no one had spoken aloud, not even George himself. Miller sat in silence beside George, feeling the ocean breeze cool, the heat of shame still clinging to his skin. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to sit in the presence of someone whose quiet carried more weight than any rank or ribbon. George watched the waves roll in with a stillness that felt ancient, as though each breath carried a memory that only he could bear. Miller sensed that the man beside him had survived more than history books could ever capture. George shifted slightly, the movement slow and deliberate, as if guided by habit rather than effort. His eyes remained on the horizon, but something in his expression hinted at a story waiting just beneath the surface. Miller waited, not daring to speak until spoken to. The air between them felt fragile, filled with a solemn respect he had never experienced before. It was as though they were sharing a moment, suspended between past and present. "You know," George began, his voice low and steady. "People like to talk about medals. They like to remember the parts that shine." His fingers brushed the edge of the pin on his lapel, the gesture almost unconscious. "But the shine is not what stays with you." Miller leaned slightly closer, careful not to interrupt. The old man's words carried the weight of lived truth, the kind learned only through loss. George breathed in deeply, the air seeming to thicken around him. "I was not supposed to come home from Luzon," he said quietly. "None of us were. The night we went in, we knew the odds." His voice carried no pride, only a quiet sorrow that settled into the space between them. "They called me a ghost when I returned, but the truth is, the ghosts were the ones who did not." The admission lingered like a shadow across the bench. Miller felt a chill run up his spine. He had read George's record by then, every detail that had been declassified. He had memorized the accounts of Operation Nightfall, the brutal conditions, the impossible survival, but hearing it from the man himself felt different. It felt heavier, more personal, more devastating. Miller realized that George had not been forged into a legend by victory, but by the burden of carrying the memories of men who never came home. George let the silence settle again, before continuing. "When I made it back," he said, "they gave me a medal. They handed me a citation and thanked me for my bravery." He paused, eyes narrowing slightly as though watching a scene long gone. But no one ever asked me about my team. No one asked me what it cost. His hand tightened slightly around the pin, the worn metal catching the afternoon light. People forget that survival has a price. Istaman. Miller swallowed, his chest tightening with empathy. He had never expected to feel. He had faced danger before, fast roping in high winds, diving at night in hostile waters. Firefights that lasted seconds but felt like hours. But nothing in his experience compared to what George described. Nothing had ever forced him to carry the memory of losing everyone around him. Nothing had ever made him the lone survivor. Until now, Miller had never understood how heavy that word really was. George turned his head for the first time, meeting Miller's gaze directly. His light blue eyes held no judgment. Only truth. "You think being strong is about the body?" he said softly. "But real strength. The kind that lasts. That comes from the heart." He tapped his chest lightly. "From what you choose to carry. From how you choose to treat the people around you." Miller felt his throat tighten again. The lesson cut deeper than any reprimand or training lecture ever had. Arrogance is easy. George continued. Anyone can wear a uniform, or a trident, or a medal. But humility, that takes work. He leaned back slightly, the sunlight catching the lines on his face. The quietest men in the room are often the ones who earn the right to speak the loudest. Miller understood the message was not an insult, it was an invitation. A path forward, a challenge to become someone worthy of the legacy he represented. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The waves rolled in steady rhythms. The seagulls circled and squawked. The world moved gently around them, unbothered by the weight of the conversation unfolding on the bench. Then George exhaled slowly. The sound almost peaceful. "You will be a fine sailor one day." "Miller," he said, "if you learn to listen more than you speak." It was the closest thing to a blessing Miller had ever received. Miller nodded, unable to find words that matched the depth of what he felt. He stared at the horizon, seeing not just the ocean, but a future shaped by humility instead of ego. George had given him a second chance, something he had not earned, but would spend years trying to honor. In that moment, Miller made a promise to himself. He would never again forget the lineage he stood in. He would never again mistake strength for superiority. A breeze swept across the park, rustling the palm fronds above them. George closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the wind wash over him. It softened the lines on his face, making him look almost peaceful. Then he opened his eyes slowly, turned his gaze back toward the sea, and whispered, "There is something else you must know." His voice trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of something long buried. Miller leaned in, sensing the gravity beneath those words. George's fingers rested gently on the pin one more time, as he prepared to reveal the piece of his story he had never spoken aloud, not to the Admiral, not to the Master Chief, not even in the official report of Operation Nightfall. And as he inhaled, steadying himself to finally share it, the world around them seemed to hold its breath, because the darkest truth of Luzon was about to surface. George's fingers traced the worn edges of the pin on his lapel, as if the metal itself held the memory he was about to reveal. The afternoon sun dipped lower, stretching long shadows across the park bench where he and Miller sat. For a moment, George did not speak, as though he were sifting through 70 years of silence to find the one truth he had never dared to voice. Miller waited, barely breathing, sensing the gravity of what was coming. "When my team leader gave me this pin," George finally said, "he was not just giving me a symbol." His voice remained soft, but the tremor beneath it was unmistakable. "He was giving me a message, one I did not understand until later." Miller leaned in slightly, the weight of the moment anchoring him to the bench. George's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, as if the truth lived somewhere beyond the waves. "The mission was compromised before we even hit the water," George said. "We knew something was wrong the moment we neared the island. There were too many spotlights, too many patrols. Someone had tipped them off." His jaw tightened, and for the first time, Miller saw anger in the old man's eyes. Not at the enemy, but at betrayal. "We walked into a trap. 12 went in. I was the only one who made it out." "Oh," Miller felt a cold ripple move through him. He had read the official report, and none of it hinted at betrayal. None of it suggested there had been an inside leak. George continued before Miller could speak. The brass never admitted it. They never wrote it down. But we all knew, he swallowed hard, someone in our own chain of command gave enemy forces our entry point. My team died because of it. Oh. The revelation hit Miller like a punch to the gut. Betrayal from within was one of the deepest fears in special warfare. A horror whispered about only in the quiet corners of training rooms, but hearing it from George made it real, far too real. Mr. Stanton, Miller began, but he stopped when George lifted a hand slightly. I survived, George said, but survival is not the same as living. His eyes darkened with the weight of memories that refused to fade. For the next 72 hours, I kept moving, not because I was brave, but because I could not bear the thought of dying without knowing why my brothers had been sacrificed. He paused, letting the words settle, and in those hours, I learned something I never told anyone. Indo. Miller felt a chill roll down his spine. George's breathing steadied, but his voice lowered. My team leader, before he died. He whispered a name. The sentence hung between them like a suspended blade. Miller felt the air thin around them as he waited for the next words. A name, George repeated softly. The man he believed had betrayed us. The park seemed to go silent. Even the sound of seagulls faded as though the world were leaning in. Miller could feel his heartbeat thudding against his ribs. George's eyes fell to the pin, his thumb brushing the smooth metal surface. He told me to make it home, George said, to tell them what happened. To make sure the ones we lost were not forgotten. Miller watched him carefully. The old man's eyes glistened, but he held himself with the same quiet dignity he had shown in the mess hall. But when I returned, George continued, the Navy gave me medals and ceremonies. They praised the mission's success. They buried the truth with the men who died. His voice sharpened with disappointment that time had not softened. They told me not to speak of the betrayal. They told me it was classified. They told me to move on. Oh gee. Miller's breath caught in his throat. He realized now that the silence George carried was not only grief, it was the weight of a truth locked away for decades. I tried, George said quietly. I tried to honor the men we lost. I tried to keep their memory alive. His hand trembled slightly over the pin. But I never spoke the name? Not once. Not to anyone. The sky grew darker, the light fading as though the world itself braced for what was about to be revealed. Miller leaned forward. Voice. Almost a whisper. Mr. Stanton, he asked carefully, why are you telling me this now? George inhaled, his breath trembling. Because someone must carry the truth, he said. Someone younger. Someone who still believes the uniform means something. His gaze shifted to Miller, solemn and steady. Someone who can understand what it means to be tested. Then George's voice dropped to a near whisper. And because the man who betrayed us, he did not act alone. Miller froze, every muscle in his body tightening. The meaning of the words struck him with sudden clarity. There were others. George nodded once. Slowly, and they were never found. The breeze stilled for a moment, as if the earth itself held its breath. Because George was not just sharing a memory, he was opening a door to a secret that had been sealed since 1943. A secret that someone, somewhere, might still want to keep buried. Miller felt the weight of George's words settle into his chest like a stone dropped into deep water. The idea that betrayal had lived inside the mission, inside the Navy itself, sent a shock through him stronger than any blast he had trained for. He tried to steady his breathing, but the gravity of the moment made the air feel thin. George watched him quietly, as if measuring whether the young man was strong enough to carry what came next. The name your team leader whispered? Miller said slowly. Was it someone high-ranking? George's eyes narrowed slightly. Not in anger, but in remembrance. Higher than you would expect, he replied. High enough that speaking it out loud now would still stir up ghosts better left sleeping. His voice carried a cautious tone, the kind used by men who had survived long enough to fear not death, but memory. Miller felt a cold shiver run down his spine. I never spoke that name. George continued. Because back then, truth was not armor. It was a target. His gaze drifted to the distant pier where sailors moved like tiny silhouettes under the fading sun. If I had said it, I would not have lived long enough to be sitting here with you. The implication hung in the air. Someone in power had once wanted the truth buried, and someone still might. Miller shifted slightly, feeling the bench beneath him suddenly too small. The idea that an internal betrayal from 1943 might have tendrils reaching into the present day unsettled him deeply. "Do you think the men involved are still alive?" he asked. George exhaled slowly. The sound filled with tired certainty. "Men D," he said. "But legacies do not?" His eyes darkened. "Sometimes, the people who protect those legacies are the ones you do not see coming." "Oh." The breeze picked up again, carrying the faint scent of salt across the park. George leaned back, the movement stiff but deliberate, as if grounding himself in the present before speaking further. "I kept that name to myself," he said, "but I did watch the careers of certain officers very closely." His tone sharpened. Some rose too quickly. Some retired too quietly. Some had influence long after their uniforms were hung up. Miller felt his pulse quicken. This was no longer just a story from the past. It was a thread connecting two eras. George glanced at Miller with surprising intensity. "When you mocked my pin," he said, "I thought of those men again. I thought of how easily arrogance blinds youth to the cost of loyalty." His voice softened. "You reminded me of myself before I knew what betrayal looked like." The words struck Miller harder than any reprimand he had ever received. The shame he carried from the mess hall deepened into something more profound. "I am telling you this," George continued, "because I see a crossroads in you." He tapped two fingers lightly against his chest. "Men in your line of work are given strength early, but wisdom comes late. If you learn nothing else from me, learn this. Strength without humility invites corruption." Miller swallowed hard, the lesson burning through him with clarity he could not ignore. The park grew quieter as the sun dipped lower, turning the sky a muted orange. George's expression shifted not to fear, but to a contemplative sadness. "I never hunted the men behind that betrayal," he said. "I carried the truth, but I did not chase it." Miller frowned. "Unsure why?" George continued, answering the unspoken question. "Because the cost of revenge would have taken everything I had left, and the men I loved deserved better than that." Miller nodded slowly, taking in each word, as if collecting pieces of a puzzle he had never known existed. George's voice softened even more. "Yet sometimes," he said, "the past finds its way back to the present." Miller felt a sudden ripple of unease. "What do you mean?" he asked. George looked at him, the lines in his face deepening with something that resembled concern. "A few days before I visited the base," George said, "I received a letter." His tone changed lower, careful, alert. No return address, no signature. Nothing but one sentence typed on a plain sheet of paper. Miller leaned forward, tension tightening across his shoulders. George paused before speaking the words slowly. It said, "There are things you left unfinished. All their death." The silence that followed felt electric. Miller's mind raced, struggling to grasp the implications. "Do you think it was connected to Operation Nightfall?" he asked. George nodded once. "I know it was." His voice held no doubt. "No one alive today would know what I left unfinished except the men who were there, or the people who protected the ones who betrayed us." Miller felt the air go cold around him. There was a second page. George added quietly, "Blank except for one thing." He slipped a hand into the inside pocket of his jacket, fingers brushing something thin and folded. Miller watched, breath caught in his chest. George pulled out a small envelope, yellowed at the edges, and held it between two fingers. "I brought it with me," he said. "I was going to give it to the Admiral after the ceremony. Miller stared at the envelope, sensing danger in the way it seemed to hum with unspoken history. "What is inside?" he asked. George looked down at it, his expression unreadable. "Coordinates," he said finally. "Coordinates and a date." The answer struck Miller with the force of a hammer. The air grew tense, as if the truth itself were drawing closer. "Whoever sent this," George whispered, "knows something the world was never meant to uncover." Miller felt his heartbeat thunder. George watched him calmly, the envelope still in his hand. And then George said the words that made Miller's skin prickle. "I think they're waiting for me." The wind stilled, the world paused, and the weight of 70 years pressed down on both men at once. George held the envelope gently between his fingers, as though the thin paper carried something heavier than ink. Miller style edit, feeling an unease that tightened around his spine, like a slow coil. The idea that someone from George's past, someone connected to a long-buried betrayal, had reached out after so many decades felt almost impossible. Yet the envelope made it undeniable. "When did you receive this?" Miller asked cautiously. 3 days before the memorial," George answered. "Delivered to my doorstep with no carrier mark. No postal stamp. Nothing." His voice carried a quiet gravity that made Miller's stomach knot. Someone put it there by hand. The implication was clear. Whoever wanted to reach George did not want their trail visible. That kind of planning belongs to people who moved in shadows, not strangers, sending sentimental letters. Miller leaned back slightly, trying to steady the rush of adrenaline building in his chest. "Have you opened it?" he asked. George shook his head. "Not yet. I could not bring myself to..." His eyes drifted across the water. Calm, but distant. I knew that whatever was inside would pull me back into something I thought I had left behind. His tone hinted at a mixture of dread and obligation. But the men who died deserve the truth, even if it comes late. Oak. A seagull swooped low, wings brushing the air between them, breaking the tension for only a moment. Miller's thoughts churned. "Do you think it is a trap?" he asked. George sighed, his shoulders heavy. "At my age, son, everything could be a trap." His voice softened. "But sometimes, traps are the last place the truth hides." The words landed with a weight that made Miller's pulse thrum harder. Slowly, George began unfolding the envelope. Careful not to tear the fragile paper, Miller watched every movement with razor focus, unable to shake the feeling that they were crossing a threshold. Inside was a single sheet of paper, creased once down the center. George opened it with steady hands. Though Miller could see a hint of trembling at the edges of his fingers, the page revealed a set of numbers typed in clean, even rows. "They are coordinates," George confirmed quietly. "Specific ones." Miller leaned closer, studying the sequence. The format was unmistakable latitude and longitude. The numbers pointed somewhere precise, somewhere deliberate. His training took over, running through possible regions and mission logs. Then he froze. "These numbers," he whispered, "they point to Luzon, M3. George nodded slowly. "Exactly where we went in," he said. "Exactly where the mission fell apart." His voice held the edge of something deeper, fear. "Maybe, or resolve." And below the coordinates, the date? Miller looked again, bracing himself. The date was typed clearly, unmistakably. It was not from the past. It was not a reference to the operation. It was a date only 2 weeks from now. The realization slammed into Miller with the force of a wave. "They want you to go back," he said. George's eyes remained fixed on the page, as though it held the face of someone long dead. "Or they want me to finish what I started," he murmured. The wind picked up, rustling the trees behind them. The world felt suddenly sharper, more alert. Even the gulls seemed to circle closer, as though sensing something shifting beneath the surface. Miller felt anger pushing through the confusion inside him. "This is insane," he said. "You are 87 years old. You cannot go back into a situation like this." George gave a faint smile. Thin but knowing, age does not end a promise. "Son," he folded the paper carefully and slid it back into the envelope. "My team leader asked me to tell their story. To finish what they tried to do." His voice thickened with emotion. "If the truth is finally surfacing, I owe it to them." "Who?" Miller shook his head, wrestling with disbelief. "You think the betrayal is connected to whatever this is?" he asked. George nodded once, the movement slow and certain. "If the man who betrayed us acted with others, their motives did not vanish with time." He looked at Miller, his pale eyes piercing. "Secrets like this rot. They grow roots. They do not die when the men do." Inden. The horizon glowed with the deepening colors of dusk. Shadows stretched farther across the park. Miller felt urgency rising in him. Sharper now. You have to tell someone, he said. The Admiral, Master Chief Thorne, anyone. George sighed. The sound weary. I planned to, he said, but after what happened in the mess hall, I realized something important. Miller frowned, confused. What? George faced him fully. The truth settling in his expression. People forget. Even good men, even the Navy. His gaze softened. But you did not forget today. You stepped up when no one else did. Miller felt heat rise in his chest, part humility. Bar disbelief. Mr. Stanton. I was terrified. George gave a small nod. Courage is not about not being afraid. It is doing what must be done, despite the fear. Oh, the words pressed deep into Miller's heart, anchoring something inside him he did not know he had been missing. Silence stretched between them again, filled with unspoken understanding. Then George looked down at the envelope, his hand closed around it gently, with the solemnity of a man gripping a final thread to the past. I think, George said quietly, that whoever sent this expects me to die. Miller's heart lurched. George's voice lowered into something that chilled the air. But if they expect me to go alone, they are mistaken. Miller stared at him, realizing in that moment that George was not just sharing information. He was asking for something dangerous, something life-changing, and something Miller had not expected to face when he woke that morning. The old man turned his eyes back to the horizon. Because the ghosts of Luzon, George whispered, are not finished yet. Of Ficht. The last light of day slid across the water as Miller sat frozen, George's words echoing through him. He felt the weight of the envelope, the coordinates, the date, the betrayal. Each piece fitting together like a puzzle he never knew existed. The idea of an unfinished mission from 1943 resurfacing now made his skin prickle. Yet the steady calm in George's expression told him the old man had already accepted whatever came next. George leaned back against the bench, his breath slow and controlled. You are wondering why I am telling you this, he said quietly. Miller nodded, unable to form a response. Because someone will need to stand where I can no longer stand. George continued. Someone who knows what loyalty means. Someone who has learned the cost of arrogance. The message was clear. Even before George said the words that followed, someone like you. Miller felt his throat tighten. He had spent his career training to be strong, fast, and unbreakable, but nothing had prepared him for the trust George was placing on his shoulders. He opened his mouth to speak, but George raised a hand gently. Do not answer yet, he said. A choice like this cannot be made quickly, and it must not be made for me. His gaze shifted toward the waves again. Deep and reflective, it must be made for the truth. The breeze cooled as the sun finally dipped behind the horizon. The park grew quieter as families left and joggers headed home, leaving only the two men and the distant sounds of waves hitting the beach. Miller's mind raced with questions, but one rose above the others. If someone wanted to kill you, he said softly, why reveal themselves now? George inhaled deeply, his chest rising with a slow and weary motion. Because time is running out, he said. Not just for me, but for whatever they have been hiding. Almighty. Miller studied the envelope again, noticing its stiffness, the faint yellowing at the edges. It looked like something preserved, not created recently. This letter, he said, it could have been planned for years. George nodded. Décades. Even some secrets do not die. They wait. His voice turned somber, and sometimes the people tied to them wait too. The unspoken implication chilled Miller more than the dusk air. George closed his eyes for a long moment, his breath steadying. I spent my life trying to forget, he said, but forgetting does not erase what happened. It only delays the day it returns. His words held decades of sorrow, layered with the kind of wisdom that comes only from surviving the unimaginable. Miller felt a sharp ache in his chest, realizing how much the old man had carried alone. A faint tremor ran through George's hand as he held the envelope. It was the first visible sign of age he had shown since the mess hall. Miller instinctively reached out. steadying George's wrist. The contact surprised them both. George looked up at him, and for the first time, a small smile touched the corners of his mouth. "You see," he said, "even ghosts need someone to lean on eventually." The quiet humor softened the moment, but did not lessen the gravity beneath it. Miller drew in a slow breath, knowing he had to ask the question that had been forming since the coordinates were revealed. "If this is connected to the betrayal," he said carefully, "what do you think they want to finish?" George opened his eyes fully, and in them Miller saw both exhaustion and resolve. "Loose ends," he replied. "Truth. Silence. Maybe revenge?" His voice lowered. "Or perhaps they simply want to ensure no one will ever uncover what truly happened." The night air deepened as the final glow of the sun disappeared. Streetlights flickered on along the path, casting warm halos across the pavement. George's gaze followed the lights for a moment before he spoke again. "There is something you must remember." "Miller," he said, "the past does not return without purpose. If it has come for me now, then something is moving beneath the surface of this world." His expression tightened, and we may not be the only ones who feel it. Ember. Miller felt a cold shudder pass through him. "Do you think the Admiral knows anything?" he asked. George shook his head slowly. "Not this. Not the betrayal. Not the leak. They buried it too deeply." His voice darkened. "But if he learns someone is reaching into the past," he paused, choosing his words with care, "he will not let it go quietly." The implication was clear. Whatever this was, it had the potential to shake the Navy itself. George looked back at the water, his face illuminated by the distant streetlights. "There is one last thing I need to tell you," he said softly. Miller braced himself, his pulse quickening. George's eyes narrowed with memories he had never allowed to surface. "During those 72 hours on Luzon," he said, "I found something I never included in my report." The confession hit Miller with surprise. George had never deviated from truth except, perhaps, when truth was too dangerous to speak. "What did you find?" Miller asked quietly. George's voice dropped into a whisper. "A message carved into a rock near our insertion point." His eyes darkened with the memory. It was a warning, written by one of my men during the final moments before he died. Miller felt his heartbeat stagger. "What did it say?" he pressed. George inhaled shakily, as though forcing the words through a wall of grief. "It said," George whispered, "do not trust the officers. They knew." And Miller felt the world tilt. His breath caught sharply, his mind spiraling as every assumption he had about Operation Nightfall fractured at once. George closed his eyes again, pain tightening the lines of his face. "I never told anyone," he said. "I was afraid they would bury me alongside the truth." His voice trembled. "But now, I fear something worse. That the people who benefited from the betrayal had children, protegés, successors. Oh, the envelope lay between them like a single ember capable of igniting an inferno, and as the wind stilled once more, Miller realized with chilling clarity, this was no longer just George's unfinished story. It was becoming his too. The night settled fully over the park, washing the landscape in muted blues and soft gold from the streetlights. Miller sat motionless, the shock of George's final revelation tightening his chest. The words carved into the stone they knew echoed through his mind, slicing through everything he thought he understood about loyalty, command, and the sanctity of the chain of command. George's silence over the decades suddenly made a devastating kind of sense. George breathed slowly, steady, despite the weight of the memory he had just released. "I carried that message with me my entire life," he said quietly, "but I did not have the power to confront what it meant." His eyes closed, as if he could still see the jungle shadows of Luzon behind his eyelids. "I was 20 years old, one survivor, one voice. They would have buried me in paperwork long before they buried the truth." "Oh?" Miller felt anger rise in him, not at George, but at the injustice of what had been hidden. "You should not have had to carry that alone," he said. George gave a small, worn smile. "We all carry something alone. Son, some men carry medals, some carry scars, some carry names carved in stone." His voice softened. "I carried 11. The weight of the number settled heavily between them. A silence stretched out, filled only by the distant hiss of the tide. Miller looked at George, realizing with startling clarity that the old man had lived his entire life with one foot in the present and one anchored in 1943. If these men, or their successors, are still covering this up, Miller said cautiously, then going back to Luzon might be dangerous. George nodded slowly, his gaze steady. Everything worth finishing is, The envelope rustled in George's hand as he turned it over thoughtfully. I am not asking you to follow me, he said, but I am asking you to think about the kind of man you want to become. His tone was gentle but firm. The truth has a way of testing us. It does not care if we are ready. Miller felt the lesson sink deep into the core of him, stirring something he had never confronted before. Purpose. George pushed himself up slightly on the bench, his movement slow but resolute. I will see the Admiral tomorrow, he said. He deserves to know a fraction of what is coming. Miller frowned. The knot of concern tightening again? You think he will believe you? George gave a weary chuckle. Men like Admiral Hayes do not believe. They investigate. His expression turned serious. And when he investigates, the men behind all this may feel the ground shift. A gust of wind swept across the park, carrying the scent of the ocean and a hint of storm on the horizon. George's jacket fluttered slightly, revealing the outline of the pin beneath it. Miller stared at that symbol, the worn little piece of metal that had started the entire mess hall incident, and felt a startling realization form. Mr. Stanton, he said quietly, if someone is trying to finish what began in 1943, how do we prepare for something like that? George looked at him for a long moment, the faint glow of the streetlights reflecting in his pale eyes. By remembering who we are, he said, and who they were. His hand rested over his heart, covering the pin. My men died because someone in power chose convenience over loyalty. His voice hardened. If their successors still live by that code, then they will fear one thing above all. Miller leaned in slightly, bracing himself. What's that? The truth, George said, because the truth does not care about rank, badges, or decades of silence. Once it surfaces, it burns everything in its path. The words struck Miller with an almost physical force. He could feel the seriousness in George's tone, the way the old man spoke, not from anger, but from decades of knowing exactly how dangerous hidden corruption could be. The truth was the only weapon they had left. George took a slow breath and carefully folded the envelope again. I will go to Luzon, he said, and I will go alone if I must. Miller shook his head before he could stop himself. You cannot go alone, he said firmly, not with everything you just told me. For the first time, George looked surprised. Miller, he said gently, this is not your burden to carry. Miller straightened, his voice resolute. Maybe not, but it is a burden that someone has to share. Oh. A long silence followed, broken only by the distant sound of waves. George's expression softened, his eyes warming with something close to pride. You remind me of my team leader, he said, always ready to take more weight than he should. The compliment struck Miller deeply, lifting something in him he had not known was there. He realized then that George was not asking for a soldier, he was asking for a witness. Someone to help ensure that the truth did not die again. George stood slowly, leaning on the bench for support. The night sky had turned fully dark now, a faint streak of moonlight reflecting across the calm water. Miller rose beside him, instinctively staying close enough to offer support if needed. But far enough to respect the old man's dignity, George glanced toward the distant lights of the base, glowing faintly through the trees. There is one more thing you should understand, George said. Whatever waits at those coordinates, it was meant for me. His voice deepened. But whoever sent this letter may not care who walks into the trap, only that someone does. Miller felt a chill crawl down his arms. Then we cannot walk in blind, he said. George nodded. No, we cannot. They stood together in silence. Two figures, separated by nearly 7 decades of life, but now bound by a single unbroken thread of truth. Miller felt the heaviness of the moment settle in his chest. This was no longer a story about disrespect in a mess hall, no longer a tale of a forgotten hero. No longer a lesson in humility. It was the opening of a path neither of them could turn away from, and somewhere across the ocean, on an island touched by blood and betrayal, a secret waited, a secret that did not want to be found,